Professor Meyer, are you familiar with the case being argued before the Supreme Court today, Bond versus the United States?
I am.
Can you speak to how that is relevant to our discussion here today on this treaty?
Well, sure. To be very brief, Ms. Bond was convicted of violating the Chemical Weapons Implementation Act.
In federal court, correct?
In federal court, correct. So it's the federal statute implementing the Chemical Weapons Convention. What's basically at issue is whether or not Congress had the authority to pass the Chemical Weapons Implementation Act. Under a case dating back now 90 plus years called Missouri v. Holland, the Supreme Court held that in at least some circumstances, if the treaty power authorizes the federal government to make a treaty and the treaty is otherwise valid, Congress may have the authority to enact a statute that it would not otherwise have under any of its enumerated powers.
The authority of their obligation, I'm just going to read out of Article 4, General Obligations of the Treaty. It says, to this end, Article 4 requires state parties to adopt all appropriate measures to implement the rights in the Convention, modify legislation and practices that discriminate against persons with disabilities. That seems like a rather strong obligation. What am I missing here?
Senator, it seems like a strong obligation. It says these state parties undertake to ensure and promote the full realization of all human rights and fundamental freedoms.
So to me, I'm hearing from supporters of the bill that this doesn't obligate the U.S. to do anything. It sounds to me like it's a very strong obligation. Mr. Ferris, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, Senator. That's exactly the point. The United States is making a solemn promise in international law that we will comply with the treaty. And despite whatever federalism reservations or other reservations, those simply have the effect of deciding which agency of government has the duty of implementing a treaty, the courts or the Congress or the states, but the duty to implement the treaty is never extinguished. We have to implement the treaty or else we're in violation of international law. Now, does that mean that somebody can actually invade this country militarily because we don't comply with the treaty? Enforcement of international law is problematic in a general sense. And so can they force us to obey the treaty? No, not realistic. They can't force us to. But are we going to undertake a treaty knowing that we're going to disobey it? That's not right. We ought to undertake a treaty obligation only if we intend to fully and fairly and completely obey it in good faith. And what I'm hearing today is we're not going to do that. It's what Professor Henkin said, that when the United States pretends to ratify a treaty and actually undertakes nothing, it diminishes our standing in the world community.
Attorney General Thornburg, I think we all kind of recognize that the U.S. is sort of the gold standard on disability rights. So again, what I'm trying to grapple with, if we're already the gold standard, I mean, I certainly understand why it's in our best interest to have other countries obligate themselves to meet our gold standard. I'm just not quite getting why we should be ratifying a treaty that obligates us to do things that are still open to subject to interpretation. I mean, that is my concern. I think that's kind of the core concern of those that may not be supportive of the treaty currently. Can you explain that to me?
I think so. The basic gap, I think, in understanding is what the consequences of the RUDs are. The treaty that's adopted includes the reservations, understandings, and declarations that accompany it, so that when we say we're not going to do something that we have specified we do not include within the ambit of the treaty as amended by the RUDs, it doesn't mean that we're flouting the convention. It means that we're implementing it with the RUDs in mind. And that's true not only of what the United States does, but other countries.
If we're the gold standard, what do we have to interpret it implement as a country? What do we have to implement?
Nothing new that we're obliged to do under this because, frankly, it draws so completely and thoroughly on the Americans with Disabilities Act.
So again, what is the benefit? Why does the U.S. have to do this? I understand, again, why other countries, it's very beneficial to us and our members of service members to have other countries ratify this and implement it. I'm still not quite getting why we have to.
The U.S. is a world leader Senator.
And
in
we
this
passed
area.
Americans
And
Disability Act showing that leadership.
in order to preserve that status and maintain its credibility as the gold standard manufacturer, we simply have to share that insight that we've acquired and urge the other nations of the world within a structured framework to follow that in order to assure that those countries and their citizens, who we've heard described today in some detail, suffer from the lack of this kind of statute, their right to bootstrap themselves into a gold standard position.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I think, Senator, you raise a question that many have raised, and I think it deserves a considered answer. Let me take a moment simply to say, while I and many others believe this treaty will not impose any new obligation on the United States, since we already have the highest standard in the world, our advocacy as virtue by signing on to the treaty and ratifying it puts us in a leadership position to get the world to move in the direction so that Tammy Duckworth or Mark Kirk or anyone similar will be able to travel anywhere in the world and have the greater likelihood that their access fulfill their God-given potential, whether that is in a job, whether that is in business, whether that is for travel, whether it is for advocacy, will be able to achieve. And that American businesses, who already lead the world in terms of accessibility standards, that those standards will be the standards that other countries will adopt, so that, you know, Eric LeGrand, the football player from Rutgers who has this big wheelchair, motorized wheelchair, will be able to travel another place in the world and likely be able to have the access. And so that's why ratification of the treaty expands our reach and our advocacy to ultimately get the world, not simply by a reflection of looking at what the United States does, but its advocacy. I think it's a very good question. It's been raised, and I think it deserves
Mr. Chairman,
a thoughtful answer.
Mr. Chairman, could I offer a few comments?
Let me, if I can,
right,
let me
very
turn
good.
to Senator Cardin, and then we'll get you